HOA Karen's husband stole my $45,000 tractor, convinced I was just another farmer he could bully. His confidence vanished forever the moment he saw the federal badge hanging from my belt. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. Some people think stealing expensive equipment is easy. The hard part begins when they discover exactly who they've stolen it from. The first sound that morning wasn't birdsong or the familiar rumble of my diesel engine warming beneath the rising sun. It was the metallic clank of heavy chains tightening around $45,000 worth of machinery that had never belonged to anyone except me. I stepped onto my front porch with a mug of black coffee still warming my hands just as the first streaks of dawn stretched across the rolling fields surrounding my farm. Cool autumn air carried the scent of fresh hay, damp earth, and diesel exhaust drifting from the flatbed tow truck parked beside my equipment shed. My bright green tractor, polished only 2 days earlier after finishing the fall harvest, was already halfway onto the trailer. Hydraulic winches groaned under its weight, while steel cables scraped against the loading ramps. Gravel crunched beneath heavy tires. Every sound echoed through the quiet countryside with uncomfortable clarity. Standing beside the truck, wearing expensive work boots that had clearly never touched real farmland, was Grant Whitmore. He adjusted a pair of sunglasses despite the sun barely breaking over the horizon and smiled as though he were collecting abandoned junk instead of someone else's property. Behind him stood his wife, Melissa Whitmore, president of the Willow Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She folded her arms across a spotless cream jacket and watched the operation unfold with the satisfied confidence of someone convinced no one would dare question her authority. "Morning, Nathan," Grant called casually. HOA determined this equipment violates community appearance standards. "We're removing it." I looked from him to the tractor, then toward the laminated notice taped crookedly to my barn door. It claimed the tractor had been abandoned in violation of neighborhood regulations. Abandoned? I had been driving it less than 12 hours earlier. "That's private property," I replied quietly. Grant shrugged as though ownership had become a minor technicality. "Take it up with the board." Several neighbors had already wandered outside after hearing the truck. Curtains shifted. Porch lights flickered on. Nobody crossed the road. They simply watched, the same way people watch approaching storms when they already know nothing they say will change the weather. Melissa glanced around to make sure everyone had an audience before speaking loud enough for nearby homes to hear. Rules exist for a reason. Everyone has to follow them. I almost smiled. Over the previous year, I'd learned that whenever Melissa mentioned rules, she usually meant power. I reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone. Without saying another word, I started recording. Grant noticed immediately. He laughed. "Go ahead. Film all you want." One of the tow truck operators hesitated for a second before continuing to tighten the chains. His expression suggested he wasn't completely comfortable with the situation, but a paycheck has convinced many decent people to ignore instincts they should have trusted. My tractor rolled higher onto the trailer, its rear tires leaving fresh tracks through the dew-covered grass. I watched every movement without raising my voice, without threatening anyone, without stepping in front of the truck. Melissa interpreted my silence exactly the way bullies usually do. She mistook restraint for surrender. As Grant climbed into the driver's seat, he leaned out the window with a grin that practically celebrated victory. "If you think this is unfair," he shouted, "hire a lawyer." Then the truck pulled away, carrying my tractor down the long gravel driveway, while dust rose behind it like smoke. I stood alone beside the empty equipment shed until the engine noise disappeared beyond the hill. They believed they had stolen the most valuable thing on my property that morning. They were wrong. What they had actually taken was the first piece of evidence that would eventually destroy everything they believed they controlled. People often assume that if someone lives on a farm, they must spend every waking hour thinking about crops, fences, and weather. That assumption has a remarkable way of making intelligent people careless. My name is Nathan Brooks, and as far as everyone inside Willow Ridge Estates knew, I was nothing more than the quiet farmer who owned a few acres beyond the subdivision entrance. I rarely attended HOA meetings, never argued over neighborhood gossip, and usually answered complaints with little more than a polite nod before returning to work. The farm had belonged to my grandfather long before expensive homes surrounded it. Rolling pastures stretched behind an old red barn, bordered by oak trees that had stood there longer than anyone serving on the HOA board. Every morning began the same way. Sunrise spilled across the fields, dew settled over the grass, and the steady rhythm of diesel engines mixed with birds calling from the fence posts. I preferred that sound of conversation. My tractor wasn't simply another piece of machinery. It was the backbone of the property. The machine planted fields, repaired gravel roads, lifted hay bales, cleared fallen trees after storms, and maintained nearly every acre I owned. I had purchased it 4 years earlier after saving for nearly a decade. $45,000 represented far more than equipment. It represented years of discipline, sacrifice, and work. Melissa Whitmore never cared about any of that. She cared about appearances. As president of the HOA, she treated every mailbox, hedge, driveway, and fence line as though they existed under her personal supervision. Her newsletters constantly reminded residents that property values depended on strict enforcement. Behind the carefully written language hid something much simpler: control. Grant enjoyed exercising that control even more than she did. Unlike Melissa, who wrapped every demand inside polished corporate language, Grant preferred direct intimidation. He drove through the neighborhood in a spotless pickup truck, stopping whenever he spotted someone trimming trees or repairing a fence. Advice quickly became criticism. Criticism became threats. Most homeowners discovered it was easier to comply than argue. I wasn't interested in arguing either. That frustrated him. A week before the tractor disappeared, Grant parked beside my barn while I was replacing a broken section of fencing. The afternoon breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut cedar and engine oil while a pair of horses grazed quietly nearby. He leaned against his truck with the confidence of someone convinced he already knew how the conversation would end. "You know," he said, looking toward my equipment shed, "that tractor really ruins the view from the subdivision." I drove another fence post into the ground before answering. "The subdivision was built after this farm." He smirked. "Neighborhoods change. Property lines don't." His smile faded just enough for me to notice. Melissa arrived a few minutes later carrying another clipboard. She walked the edge of my pasture without asking permission, making notes as though she were inspecting property she owned. "You've received several reminders about visual compliance," she announced. "I've received several letters," I corrected calmly. She tapped the clipboard with one perfectly manicured finger. "Sometimes people need encouragement." I looked across the pasture where my tractor sat beside the equipment shed, freshly washed after finishing another long day in the fields. I found encouragement works best when it's voluntary. Neither of them laughed. Grant climbed back into his truck, slammed the door harder than necessary, and spun gravel across the roadside before driving away. Melissa lingered for another moment, studying the tractor with an expression that felt less like annoyance and more like calculation. I watched them disappear around the curve in the road. Most people would have seen an uncomfortable conversation. I saw something else entirely. For the first time, Grant hadn't been looking at my land. He had been looking at my tractor the way a man studies something he already believes he has the power to take. Bullies rarely begin by taking something valuable. They begin by testing whether anyone will stop them. Looking back, I realized Grant and Melissa had spent months measuring limits before they ever touched my tractor. Every warning letter, every surprise inspection, every unnecessary complaint served the same purpose. They weren't enforcing rules. They were trying to discover how much control they could seize before someone finally pushed back. The first certified notice arrived after I stacked several hay bales beside my equipment shed during harvest season. Melissa claimed they created an unacceptable visual obstruction for nearby homeowners. That would have sounded almost reasonable if the hay had been visible from the subdivision. It wasn't. A line of mature oak trees completely blocked the view. I filed the letter away. The second notice claimed my gravel access road generated excessive dust. The third insisted the color of my barn roof violated neighborhood harmony. even though the barn had stood there nearly 60 years before the first HOA document ever existed. Each complaint grew more creative than the last. Each one ended inside another neatly labeled folder. Grant preferred different tactics. Instead of paperwork, he relied on intimidation disguised as confidence. One afternoon, while I was repairing a hydraulic hose on the tractor, his pickup rolled slowly across the edge of my property before stopping beside the open gate. The smell of warm diesel mixed with freshly cut grass as he climbed out carrying a tape measure he never actually used. "You know," he said, looking over the equipment with exaggerated interest, "this thing would bring a good price." "It already has one," I answered without looking up. He chuckled. "I mean if somebody else owned it." The comment floated away on the breeze, but I remembered every word. Later that week, several neighbors quietly stopped by while buying fresh produce from the small roadside stand near my driveway. Mrs. Eleanor Dawson, who had lived in the subdivision since it opened, waited until no one else was nearby before lowering her voice. "They're asking questions about your equipment." "What kind of questions?" "Whether it's financed. Whether anyone checks on it. Whether you leave town." She hesitated. It didn't sound like ordinary conversation. I thanked her without asking for names. People tell the truth more freely when they don't feel interrogated. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property as the last light faded behind the hills. The familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots blended with the distant chirping of crickets. Everything appeared normal at first glance, yet small details caught my attention. Fresh tire impressions near the back entrance. A boot print pressed into soft soil beneath the equipment shed window. A section of fence wire bent inward rather than outward. Nothing proved a crime. Everything suggested preparation. The following morning, I installed 2 additional motion-activated cameras covering angles the original system couldn't see. Both uploaded recordings directly to encrypted cloud storage rather than local drives. I also activated the factory GPS monitoring already built into the tractor, verifying every tracking alert would immediately copy to an external account. Quiet precautions. No announcements. No threats. Grant interpreted my silence exactly as I expected. 3 days later, he drove past the farm twice before sunset, slowing almost to a crawl each time he reached the equipment shed. Melissa followed in her SUV less than an hour afterward. She never stopped, but her eyes remained fixed on the tractor until the road curved out of sight. Predators often reveal themselves through repetition. They keep returning to the same target until opportunity outweighs caution. Standing outside the barn that evening, I rested one hand against the tractor's warm steel hood after another long day in the fields. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, filling the air with the familiar scent of hot metal and fresh-cut hay. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I found myself checking that the cameras were recording one more time before locking the shed. Not because I believed someone might damage the tractor. Because deep down, I had begun to suspect they weren't planning to damage it at all. They were planning to make it disappear. The morning after I installed the additional cameras, the farm looked exactly as it always had. Sunlight spilled across the pastures, a cool breeze carried the scent of freshly turned soil, and the old windmill creaked gently above the barn. Nothing appeared different. Yet experience had taught me that the most dangerous plans often unfolded beneath ordinary mornings, hidden behind routines everyone else ignored. For nearly 2 weeks, Grant stopped making comments about my tractor. He stopped driving past the equipment shed. Melissa's violation letters suddenly disappeared. Most people would have called that peace. I recognized it as patience. When someone obsessed with control becomes unexpectedly quiet, they're rarely giving up. They're waiting for better timing. Late one Friday afternoon, I drove the tractor across the northern field after finishing repairs on a drainage ditch damaged by heavy rain. The diesel engine hummed steadily beneath me while freshly turned earth released its rich scent into the cooling autumn air. By sunset, I parked the tractor inside the shed, locked the heavy sliding doors, checked the GPS monitoring through my phone, and activated every camera before heading inside the farmhouse. At 11:42 p.m., my security system sent its first notification. Motion detected. The alert lasted only a few seconds before disappearing. I opened the live camera feed. Nothing. Only darkness stretching across the equipment yard. No people. No vehicles. No movement except leaves drifting through the floodlights. False alarms happen on farms. Deer, raccoons, even wandering cattle can trigger motion sensors. I made a mental note, locked my phone, and went to bed. At exactly 4:58 the next morning, another alert arrived. This one stayed active. I opened the recording. A white tow truck rolled slowly through the back entrance instead of using the main driveway. Its headlights remained off until the vehicle reached the equipment shed. Two men climbed out wearing reflective safety jackets with magnetic company logos attached to their doors. One unlocked the shed using a key that certainly hadn't come from me. Grant stepped into view only moments later. He wasn't wearing work clothes anymore. He wore jeans, a dark jacket, leather gloves, and the same confident smile I'd seen dozens of times before. The entire operation lasted less than 9 minutes. One man started the tractor. Another guided it toward the loading ramps. Grant stood nearby talking on his phone while occasionally pointing toward the road leading back to the subdivision. Every movement suggested this wasn't spontaneous. It had been rehearsed. Then Melissa appeared. She never touched the tractor. Instead, she walked directly to my barn door carrying a bright yellow notice. She taped it neatly beside the handle before stepping away to admire her own work. Even through the silent security footage, I could almost hear her rehearsed voice announcing another violation. When the trailer finally pulled away, my tractor disappeared into the fading darkness without a single attempt to hide what had happened. No masks. No stolen license plates. No urgency. Only confidence. By the time I reached the equipment shed 20 minutes later, the notice remained exactly where Melissa had placed it. Property removed for HOA compliance enforcement. I read the sentence twice, then photographed it before removing the tape without damaging the paper. The padlock on the shed hadn't been forced. One of the duplicate keys had somehow been copied. Inside, fresh tire tracks crossed the concrete floor where the tractor had stood only hours earlier. A faint smell of diesel lingered in the cool morning air, mixed with the sharp odor of recently disturbed grease. Neighbors slowly gathered along the roadside after hearing rumors spread through the subdivision. Several looked genuinely shocked. Others refused to meet my eyes. Grant drove past less than an hour later in his pickup truck. He slowed just enough to roll down the window. "Looks like the board solved your tractor problem," he said with a grin. I slipped my phone back into my pocket after confirming the cloud upload had completed successfully. "I hope you enjoyed borrowing it," I answered calmly. He laughed. It wasn't borrowing. Then he accelerated away in a cloud of gravel dust, completely unaware that his own words had just become the final piece connecting every image, every timestamp, every GPS signal, and every camera angle into one complete story that no denial would ever erase. People expected me to call the sheriff before the dust from the tow truck had even settled. Some assumed I would storm into the HOA office demanding answers. Others waited for an angry confrontation that would give the neighborhood something new to gossip about. Instead, I locked the empty equipment shed, made a fresh pot of coffee, and began organizing evidence. Nothing unsettles a dishonest person more than realizing the victim isn't acting according to their script. The first thing I did was duplicate every recording. The cloud backups downloaded onto 2 encrypted drives while I created another copy that went into a fireproof safe inside the farmhouse. Then I photographed the empty concrete floor where the tractor had been parked, the fresh tire impressions leading toward the back entrance, the copied key marks on the padlock, and the yellow HOA notice Melissa had taped to the barn door. Every photograph carried a timestamp. Every file received its own folder. Every detail stayed exactly where I found it. Evidence loses value when people start rearranging it. By mid-morning, the GPS tracking application finally updated. A small blinking icon appeared nearly 18 miles away. The tractor wasn't hidden inside a warehouse or dismantled for parts. It sat behind a commercial equipment yard owned by a towing contractor who regularly performed work for the HOA. Interesting. The location wasn't random. It was connected. I drove there without calling anyone first. From across the road, I parked beneath a row of aging cottonwood trees and watched through binoculars. My tractor stood behind a chain-link fence beside several construction machines, waiting for transport. Fresh mud still clung to its oversized rear tires exactly as it had when it left my farm. Nobody had even bothered removing my registration decals. Grant truly believed no one could challenge him. I quietly photographed everything before leaving. No confrontation. No dramatic accusations. Only another folder filling with facts. Later that afternoon, Melissa sent every homeowner a community email explaining that the tractor had been removed under Emergency Compliance Authority because it allegedly posed a visual nuisance and violated neighborhood standards. She thanked residents for supporting the board's commitment to preserving property values. Several neighbors forwarded the message to me before lunch. Apparently, she wanted an audience. She just didn't realize she was creating additional evidence every time she pressed send. That evening, Mrs. Eleanor Dawson stopped by carrying a basket of homemade bread. She lingered near the porch, glancing toward the subdivision before speaking. "They're celebrating." I raised an eyebrow. Grant told several board members nobody would ever get that tractor back. She hesitated. "He also said you didn't have the money to fight them." I smiled politely. "He made a few assumptions. I don't think he understands who you are." Neither did most people. That had always been intentional. For years, I'd learned that people reveal far more when they believe you're ordinary. The following morning, I received another unexpected gift. The towing company accidentally emailed me an invoice intended for the HOA office. Someone had mistyped the recipient address by a single letter. Attached to the message was a detailed transport record listing the pickup location, the exact time my tractor had been loaded, the driver's signature, and the customer authorizing the removal. Grant Whitmore. His own name appeared beside the authorization line. I downloaded the document before notifying the company of its mistake. Honest errors sometimes become remarkable evidence. By sunset, my collection included surveillance video, GPS records, photographs, HOA notices, neighborhood emails, witness statements, transport documents, and Grant's recorded admission that he hadn't borrowed the tractor. Most people looked at the missing equipment and saw a theft. I looked at the growing stack of evidence and saw something entirely different. Grant hadn't stolen a tractor. He had patiently documented his own misconduct from beginning to end. He simply hadn't realized I was willing to let him finish writing the story before anyone started reading it. The phone call came 3 mornings later, just as the first rays of sunlight stretched across the eastern pasture. I had finished feeding the horses and was repairing a section of irrigation pipe when my cell phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. The display showed an unfamiliar government number. I answered with the same calm voice I'd used throughout the entire ordeal. "Mr. Brooks, speaking. We've reviewed the initial materials you submitted. We'd like you to come by this afternoon." No explanation. No unnecessary details. Only a time and an address. Exactly the way professionals usually communicated. I arrived a few minutes early. The building itself looked ordinary. Gray brick walls, tinted windows, and a nearly empty parking lot where government sedans sat beside pickup trucks coated with road dust. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee, printer toner, and polished tile floated through quiet hallways where conversations rarely rose above a respectful tone. A supervisor greeted me with a brief handshake. "We've already reviewed your video. I assumed you would. It was thorough." I almost smiled. I try not to leave gaps. For the next hour, we reviewed every document together. Security footage, GPS records, the transport invoice, Melissa's HOA notices, Grant's recorded statements, witness summaries, timestamps, cloud backup logs. Every piece supported the next without contradiction. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned authenticity. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. When the meeting ended, I stepped into the hallway carrying nothing except my phone and car keys. The file remained behind with investigators who now had far more questions than answers. As I pushed through the front entrance, voices drifted across the parking lot. Grant, Melissa, their attorney. Apparently, they had arrived for what they believed would be a routine conversation. Grant spotted me immediately. He couldn't resist. "Well," he called loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Looks like the farmer finally decided to complain." Melissa folded her arms with the same polished confidence she displayed during every HOA meeting. "You really should have accepted the board's decision, Nathan." Neither of them realized several investigators had already stepped outside behind me. Grant walked closer, stopping only a few feet away. "You've wasted everyone's time." I looked at him quietly. "I don't think so." He laughed. "Who exactly do you think is going to believe you?" For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then I reached beneath my jacket. Not quickly, not dramatically. Simply the same deliberate motion I'd repeated thousands of times throughout my career. I removed a leather credential wallet from my inside pocket and opened it. The polished federal badge caught the afternoon sunlight. Beside it rested my official identification. Grant's grin disappeared instantly. His eyes dropped to the badge, then back to my face, then back to the badge again. Color drained from his expression as recognition replaced arrogance. Melissa leaned forward, clearly trying to read the identification from where she stood. The confidence she'd carried all morning evaporated almost immediately. "You?" Grant whispered. For the first time since we'd met, he sounded uncertain. "I thought you were a farmer." I finished. "I am." The breeze stirred fallen leaves across the parking lot, while absolute silence settled between us. "I also happen to serve as a special agent with a federal law enforcement agency." Neither of them answered. They simply stared. Grant's shoulders, which had always seemed so broad whenever he stood on my property, suddenly looked strangely small. The man who had laughed while towing away my tractor now struggled to maintain eye contact. One of the investigators stepped outside holding the evidence file we'd just reviewed. He nodded toward me before turning to Grant. "Mr. Whitmore, we'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." Grant swallowed hard. Melissa instinctively reached for his arm. He didn't move. The realization had finally reached him. The quiet man he'd dismissed as nothing more than an ordinary landowner hadn't hidden behind a badge. He had simply never needed to show it until the truth had already been documented from every possible angle. By the time they recognized who I was, my identity no longer mattered nearly as much as the evidence they had spent weeks creating with their own choices. The moment Grant saw the badge, the balance of power shifted without anyone raising a voice. He had spent months believing authority belonged to whoever spoke the loudest or threatened the hardest. Standing in that parking lot, he finally understood that real authority never needed to announce itself. It simply waited until the facts were ready. The investigators escorted Grant and Melissa into separate interview rooms. That decision alone told me everything. Experienced investigators rarely separate people unless they expect the stories to change. I remained outside the interview area, exactly where I belonged. Although I served as a special agent, I had reported the theft as the victim, and I intended to remain one. The professionals assigned to the case handled every interview according to procedure, while I avoided influencing the investigation in any way. Hours passed. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old paper, while clerks quietly carried files between offices. Through the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot, where Grant's pickup still sat exactly where he had left it. Just before evening, one of the investigators stepped out carrying a slim evidence folder. "We've confirmed the towing invoice." I nodded. "And the GPS?" "Matches your timeline." He flipped another page. The transport company also provided internal dispatch logs. Interesting. That meant the written invoice wasn't the only record. The dispatcher remembered receiving a direct phone call from Grant the evening before the tractor disappeared. Phone records later confirmed multiple conversations between Grant, Melissa, and the towing contractor within the same hour. Every new record strengthened the last. Meanwhile, another investigative team visited the commercial equipment yard where my tractor had been stored. The manager initially claimed he believed the machine had been legally repossessed. That explanation lasted only until investigators requested copies of the storage agreement. There wasn't one. No ownership transfer. No repossession order. No court authorization. No sheriff's instruction. Only Grant's handwritten signature authorizing temporary storage. The manager's confidence faded quickly. He voluntarily surrendered surveillance footage showing the tractor arriving before sunrise exactly as my security cameras had recorded. The timelines matched down to the minute. Back at Willow Ridge Estates, word spread faster than Melissa had ever imagined possible. Residents who once ignored HOA meetings suddenly began reviewing years of violation notices tucked away inside kitchen drawers and filing cabinets. Several homeowners contacted investigators after recognizing similar patterns of intimidation. One retired school principal produced emails threatening liens over non-existent landscaping rules. A young family shared photographs of contractors entering their backyard without permission. An elderly veteran explained that Grant had once removed his mailbox, claiming it violated neighborhood standards. Piece by piece, a much larger picture emerged. My tractor had never been the true objective. It was simply the latest example. Melissa and Grant hadn't built an HOA. They had built a system where fear replaced cooperation. Investigators soon obtained search warrants covering HOA financial records, internal communications, and board meeting archives. Boxes of documents left the clubhouse under official supervision while curious neighbors watched from sidewalks that had once felt strangely silent. Nobody celebrated. They simply watched. For the first time, the people who had spent years inspecting everyone else's property were experiencing inspections of their own. 2 days later, I received another phone call. "Mr. Brooks," the lead investigator said, "your tractor has been recovered." I drove to the secured storage facility early the next morning. The machine stood exactly where officers had placed it after documenting every surface. Mud still clung to the tires. My toolbox remained inside the side compartment. Even the faded work gloves I'd left behind the driver's seat were exactly where I remembered. I rested one hand against the warm green hood. The steel felt reassuringly familiar beneath my fingertips. Someone asked whether I wanted to start the engine immediately. I smiled. Not yet. There was still work to finish. Recovering the tractor mattered, but recovering the truth behind everything that led to its theft mattered far more. Because stolen property can be returned in a single afternoon, trust, once taken from an entire community, requires something much more difficult to restore. And that process had only just begun. By the time the case reached court, the missing tractor had almost become the least important part of the story. It was still valuable, still worth $45,000, and still central to the original theft. But weeks of investigation had uncovered something much larger than stolen equipment. The evidence described a pattern that stretched far beyond my farm, reaching into years of intimidation that many homeowners had quietly accepted because they believed no one would ever listen. The courthouse filled long before the hearing began. Residents from Willow Ridge Estates occupied nearly every wooden bench inside the gallery. Some carried neatly organized folders containing old HOA notices. Others simply came to watch, hoping that years of unanswered complaints might finally receive attention. The room smelled faintly of polished oak, paper, and fresh coffee drifting from a nearby hallway where attorneys quietly reviewed their files. Grant entered beside his lawyer wearing the same confidence he had carried throughout the investigation. Melissa followed close behind. Although the certainty on her face had faded, she still managed the practiced smile that had intimidated homeowners for years. The prosecution opened with simplicity. No dramatic speeches. No emotional appeals. Only facts arranged in chronological order. Large display screens showed security footage from my equipment shed. Every timestamp matched the GPS records recovered from the tractor. The transport invoice appeared beside dispatch logs from the towing company. Phone records connected Grant directly to the contractor before and after the removal. Email messages demonstrated Melissa's approval of the so-called compliance action despite knowing no legal authority existed. Each exhibit strengthened the next. Nothing relied on speculation. When the tow truck driver testified, the courtroom grew unusually quiet. He admitted believing the removal had been authorized by lawful HOA procedures. Grant had assured him ownership issues had already been resolved internally. Melissa had personally handed him printed paperwork carrying official HOA letterhead. Only after investigators requested supporting legal documents did he realize none actually existed. "I wouldn't have touched that tractor otherwise," he said honestly. His testimony carried weight precisely because he accepted responsibility for his own mistake. Then came the digital evidence. Investigators presented metadata confirming that the yellow violation notice taped to my barn had been drafted only hours before the tractor disappeared. Internal HOA emails discussed removing the equipment before I could create unnecessary legal complications. One message written by Melissa included a sentence that lingered in the courtroom long after it appeared on the screen. "Once it's off his property, he'll never get ahead of this." Nobody spoke. The sentence spoke clearly enough on its own. Several homeowners then described nearly identical experiences. A retired teacher explained how Grant threatened expensive legal action over imaginary landscaping violations. A military veteran testified that Melissa repeatedly entered his property without permission during inspections. An elderly widow described paying thousands of dollars in fines she later discovered had never been authorized under the governing documents. Each story sounded different. Each followed the same pattern: pressure, intimidation, control. Grant finally took the witness stand. At first, He denied intentionally stealing anything. He insisted the tractor had merely been relocated under HOA authority. The prosecutor asked only one question. Can you identify any law, court order, or signed agreement giving you permission to remove someone else's property? Grant searched through several papers before looking toward his attorney. No answer came. Silence settled over the courtroom. Not awkward silence. Final silence. The kind that arrives when every explanation has already collapsed beneath documented facts. Melissa avoided looking toward the gallery altogether. For the first time since this entire story began, she wasn't watching the homeowners. The homeowners were watching her. As closing arguments concluded, I glanced briefly toward the recovered tractor visible through photographs displayed on the courtroom monitors. Weeks earlier, Grant believed taking that machine would prove he controlled my property. Instead, it had become the single decision that exposed years of abuse no violation letter, HOA meeting, or carefully rehearsed speech could ever conceal again. The tractor had returned. Now the truth had arrived with it. And unlike stolen equipment, the truth could never be quietly hauled away behind a tow truck. The final order was entered on a bright autumn afternoon, nearly 4 months after my tractor had disappeared behind that tow truck. Outside the courthouse, maple leaves drifted across the stone steps while a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of dry grass and approaching harvest. The crowd that gathered this time looked very different from the one that had watched the first hearing. There were no whispers filled with uncertainty anymore. People had come because they wanted to see an ending they had almost stopped believing was possible. The court found Grant responsible for unlawfully removing property he had no legal authority to seize. Civil judgments required him to compensate me for damages, towing costs, legal expenses, and the losses created while my equipment remained unavailable. Separate proceedings addressed additional issues uncovered during the investigation, and those consequences extended well beyond a single stolen tractor. Melissa resigned from the HOA board before the final votes were even counted. Several other board members followed within days. Homeowners elected an entirely new leadership team committed to transparent meetings, independent financial oversight, and written procedures that actually reflected the governing documents instead of personal opinions. For the first time in years, people attended HOA meetings without expecting an argument. The clubhouse bulletin board changed too. Violation notices slowly disappeared. Community events replaced them. Volunteer schedules. Holiday gatherings. Neighborhood cleanup projects. Children's drawings collected during a local harvest festival. Fear had quietly given way to something much stronger. Trust. A week later, I drove to the secured storage facility where my tractor had remained until every inspection was complete. The mechanic handed me the keys after completing one final report confirming the machine had suffered only minor cosmetic damage. "You've waited a long time for this," he said. "I wanted to do it the right way." He nodded. So did we. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat. The worn steering wheel fit comfortably beneath my hands. When I turned the ignition, the diesel engine answered with the same deep, steady rumble that had greeted every sunrise on my farm for years. The vibration traveled through the frame exactly as I remembered, carrying with it the faint scent of warm oil and clean metal. Some sounds remind you that certain things can survive almost anything. Driving back through Willow Ridge Estates felt strangely peaceful. Several neighbors stood near their mailboxes as I passed. Instead of lowering their eyes, they smiled. Mrs. Eleanor Dawson waved from her front porch. The retired veteran who once lost his mailbox lifted a hand in greeting. Even the tow truck driver, now working honestly for another company, nodded respectfully as our paths crossed at the intersection. No words were necessary. Everyone understood what had changed. Back at the farm, I steered the tractor across the same gravel driveway where it had been taken months earlier. The afternoon sunlight reflected from the freshly washed hood while dust settled gently behind the rear tires. I parked beside the old equipment shed, switched off the engine, and listened as the familiar ticking sound echoed through the quiet countryside while warm steel slowly cooled. For a long moment, I simply stood there, not thinking about Grant, not thinking about Melissa, not even thinking about the badge that had finally revealed who I was. I thought about choices. Grant believed power meant taking whatever he wanted. Melissa believed authority meant making everyone else afraid. Both confused intimidation with leadership. Neither understood that real authority begins with responsibility. People sometimes ask whether revealing my badge was the most satisfying moment of the entire experience. It wasn't. The best moment came much later, standing beside my tractor on an ordinary afternoon, realizing that my neighbors no longer looked over their shoulders before speaking their minds. The tractor returned to the field where it belonged. The community reclaimed the confidence it had almost lost, and I was reminded of something my grandfather used to tell me every harvest season. A machine can work the land, but only character can build a future. He was right, because justice isn't measured by the moment someone finally recognizes your badge. It's measured by what remains after the noise is gone. The truth has been heard, and decent people are finally free to live without fear again.